Welcome everyone to Next Gen Talks, the Future of Policing, a video series podcast hosted by the National Gen Z and Millennial community. Our conversation today is called Who Polices the Police? Breaking down the challenges to police accountability and transparency. We're going to be exploring the realities and challenges behind why it seems like police officers are not held accountable for misconduct and what we can do to change that. My name is Clayton Cunningham. I'm also your conversation host, and I am from LaGrande, Oregon, and I'm currently a student at Eastern Oregon University. And then we have three guests here today. We have Rachel Pickens, the Executive Director of the National Police Accountability Project.
Hi,
hello,
thanks
Rachel.
for having me. Hi, nice to meet you.
We have Lauren Bonds, the Legal Director of the National Police Accountability Project.
Hi, Clayton. Thanks for having us.
Thank you for being here. And Keith Kaufman, the Chief of Police at the Redondo Beach Police Department in California.
Yes, sir. Redondo Beach. Hi, Clayton. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So I'm going to start with kind of an overview of what we're talking about. So I'm sure most can agree that there is great utility in constitutional policing. That is a quote from a document prepared by the Department of Justice: policing conducted in accordance with the parameters set by the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, state constitutions, and many court decisions that have defined in great detail what the text of the Constitution means in terms of everyday practice of policing. So on a foundational level, that just covers protection of life, liberty, and the ability to pursue your own interests. And more specifically, it covers privacy, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, freedom not to incriminate yourself, and the right to fair trial, among other things. And the job of law enforcement, as I understand it, is to protect those things, protect people from other people doing those things or infringing on those things. But the issue that we're discussing today is the issue of accountability, and it arises when there is a failure in the policing system to recognize when certain protectionary measures are being taken advantage of or abused, it seems. And specifically, I mean like qualified immunity, which is the issue when it comes to police violence, or what was the other one? Civil asset forfeiture, right? So that's kind of the overview of what we're talking about and why we're talking about it. And kind of as a first conversational thing, I think we can go around the group here, starting with Lauren and then Rachel and then Keith, just so we know who's talking when. And then we can kind of just like agree or disagree about my setup thus far. Is that where accountability comes in, where it's an issue of abuse of protectionary measures, or is it a lack of training, or what's the issue at hand?
Thanks for the question, Clayton. So, yeah, if the question is generally, what is leading to a lack of accountability? I mean, I think that there's a couple of different, avenues. Like, are we talking about accountability for civil rights violations? You mentioned qualified immunity. I think that's a huge barrier, right? If we're talking about lack of accountability for conduct that potentially becomes criminal, that's something that's within the province and purview of prosecutors. I think if it's, accountability within, kind of internal municipal systems, I think that Chief Kaufman or Keith can probably talk about, what's going on there a little bit better. So I think there's just a lot of different kind of accountability measures that are at play depending on, the specific type of conduct that's at issue.
Well, Lauren, thanks for taking my answer. But no, it's great. No, same thing. So there's just there's not just one thing that's causing lack of accountability within policing. So just a culture of policing. There's the mechanisms, both internally and externally, that make sure that if a police officer, especially one who acts in bad faith on their job, that they, face consequences that are appropriate to that action. The type of players, when it comes to whether it's the police chief, when it comes to the officers themselves, the legal system in general, when it comes to prosecutors and judges. So it's not just, one thing we can point at to say, like, this is the reason why police officers haven't been accountable, especially, with what happened like last year with the riots and, other instances as well. And just, when we see and hear about all the instances of, citizens being attacked or killed by a police officer, or even, a law enforcement official, and the only way for them to receive any type of justice is through civil litigation. And these families will probably receive some type of payout or settlement or verdict, but then that verdict, the monetary settlement, is then paid by taxpayers, not even from the officer themselves. That too is like another reason why accountability can't grow. Other professions have various mechanisms to make sure that, if an attorney or doctor does something on the job that harms others, there's a process in which, they go through. So I think that's a big thing, is making sure there is an infrastructure for genuine accountability, and, make sure there's buy-in from both the public and from, the officers themselves who may be exposed to that infrastructure.
Yeah. Well, from my perspective, that the way you framed it, Clayton, it's great. I understand, but it is complex because we're talking about all different types of laws. We're talking about federal laws, upholding the Constitution, and then, law enforcement officers are also sworn to uphold their state laws. They're often dealing with local ordinances. So there's a whole plethora of things that could relate to accountability. The other thing that I hope we can examine in this discussion is, a lot of times police accountability, or a lack of police accountability, will be shown or talked about as the reason for a failure in the system. And I just want to make sure that as we talk about these things, that we're clear that sometimes the issue, even though our topic today is police accountability, maybe that's not the issue. Oftentimes, this is confused with excessive use of force. Someone's interchanging police accountability with excessive use of force. And so, when we examine, hey, what's the path going forward, which of course is what I'm interested in as a chief of police. I'm sure what the panel is interested in. How do we engage in this and find the path forward? We have to be clear about what it is we're talking about. The one example that I'll give is, a lot of times what is said is that, well, the police aren't being held accountable. An incident happened and you see they were acquitted, the police weren't held accountable. They're held accountable to a criminal law in that case, and a standard. And what is often not talked about is, well, what is the standard? What does Graham versus Connor mean? What exactly is the standard that a prosecutor or a jury in a criminal case is going to make a determination if this officer used excessive force? And the standard generally for many people is, well, I saw it on the video. What I saw didn't look right. They should have been held accountable. So I'm just oftentimes, we have a tough job, and it's important that the officers that we hire understand what the law is and we train them to that law. But we should also talk about what the law is when we're talking about with someone not held accountable for it. And that's kind of part of the piece that I think gets missed in lots of discussions I've had about police accountability and use of force.
I think that's a really good point, Keith. And I think a big part of what we're trying to do at the National Police Accountability Project is to make sure that the standards, the legal standards that officers are held to are represent what we think are fair and just as a society. I think the reason that there's such a disconnect in a lot of these conversations is because like the legal standard, whether it be for criminal, for an ability to succeed on a criminal prosecution or bring a civil rights case, is that threshold is too high, and it's inconsistent with, you know, what most of members of the community would think is fair and just. And so that's a lot of the legislation we've seen introduced, you know, in state legislatures and at the federal level since the, you know, events of the summer have sought to address that, right? Either getting rid of some of the barriers that exist for civil litigation, or lowering the standard, or, you know, altering some of the potential defenses one can raise in a criminal prosecution. So I think you're 100% right, but I think they kind of go hand in hand, I think, as we talk about, you know, what that looks like in a policy space.
Yeah, this is a great conversation starter on this topic, because I will tell you that the police chiefs that I work with, I work in LA County, by the way. So my town, it's Redondo Beach. It's a you know, population of about 80,000 in LA County. And so I work very closely with all of the police chiefs here. And I can tell you that in our work, we want the best policy laws that protect all members of the public, be they someone that committed a crime or someone that is a victim of a crime. I mean, the safety and security of everyone is at issue. The thing that oftentimes gets avoided in the conversation is, let's not forget about the safety and security of the officer that's trying to protect that public. And that's where, Lauren, I think the language that ends up being proposed in these laws, that's where the fight and the discussion starts with the policymakers, right? Hey, we want this state law use of force policy to say, give you an example, officers should never shoot at a moving vehicle. And then law enforcement may come back and say, in general, yeah, kind of ineffective, but maybe I can give you a couple of instances that's necessary. So let's make sure and have a carve out in there. And so what these laws end up being is rather convoluted, because there's and the other thing that I'm always cautious of, having worked 28 years now, is that we do stuff really quick. I mean, really quick. Stuff happens and, all right, what do I do? And if you start plugging in, if this, then that, if this, then that, into a law and hold officers accountable to every situation, you'll never be able to make a law big enough that covers everything that we see. So, you know, we're generally fighting for a bit more of generality in the language. And I understand the public's concern of, no, that language needs to be tightened. It is being tightened, and I feel that there is a common ground there. It's just that, you know, one of the best doctrines in Graham versus Connor is that this notion of force being used only when it's objectively reasonable, given the totality of the circumstance, that's important. But what's not often shared with the public is the litmus test to see if that was reasonable isn't, I saw it on video, it didn't look good. It's through the eyes of a like officer given that same information at the time. And so sometimes when that standard isn't met, the outcome will be, well, the police weren't held accountable. And then you'll see them held accountable maybe in a civil court, not the criminal court. So I'm glad we're talking about it.
So that question was very vague, and it was vague on purpose because I was hoping that it would spark some sort of conversation about the nature of the accountability question in general. And it was great. It was perfect. And I promise none of the rest of the questions will be that vague. Thank you for both of your input. I think noting the discretionary piece of those policies is really important, because sometimes you do have to shoot a moving vehicle, or sometimes you do have to use force, but not all the time. And it's about when, and that's appropriate and when it's not appropriate. And it's a hard line to draw, but it's something that's very important to discuss. So kind of jumping off of that starting place, we saw this summer what is hopefully going to be a catalyst for some sort of change that affects the state of policing in general. But it seems like sometimes police officers shoot an unarmed person and aren't held accountable for wrongdoing when there's video evidence that there was wrongdoing, it seems. So what roles do each person in the law enforcement game have in holding accountability to a premium? So police chiefs, the police union, politicians, and the DA, what role do they all have in this process? What are their jobs specifically? So yeah, police chief, police union, politician, DA. Let's go, Lauren, Rachel, and Keith again.
Sure. Yeah. So you might have to remind me as we go through each.
I'm writing it down.
So I'll start with police chief. And, I think, unfortunately, one thing I do want to flag and acknowledge that I think there's a lot of times police chiefs want to take potentially more aggressive action against a law enforcement officer who engages in egregious misconduct, obvious misconduct. But they're oftentimes prevented from doing that by union contracts or the state law enforcement Bill of Rights, which sets pretty, stringent standards about, when a police officer can be terminated, when a police officer can be put on unpaid leave. So I don't want to say you're totally powerless, Keith, but I would say that I think after the fact, unfortunately, there are a lot of times chiefs and other law enforcement administrators are somewhat restricted in what they can do. And I from what we hear, they're want to get these people off their force as much as anybody else, right? So I would just acknowledge that I think there's a lot of things at play that limit their ability to hold wrongdoers accountable. I would also note that a lot of what they can do is probably on the front end in terms of training, in terms of setting policies, and that is probably a place where they can ensure reasonable use of force and adequate training on the front end. In terms of the unions, I think their job isn't necessarily to hold people accountable. Their job is to protect their membership, right? I would, and this is maybe because I come from a union background, I don't know if it's reasonable, and it might be even a little bit inconsistent with their mission for that to be, their objective when they're approaching a situation like this. They're supposed to kind of zealously represent and advocate for their union members. So I might be giving them too much grace here, but I don't know, kind of what role they would logically play in this situation, given, what some of their obligations are. And then I think I'm at district attorney. So the district attorney, I think, as we mentioned, there are really high standards to meet if you're going to pursue criminal charges. We've seen, DAs like Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore try to, be responsive to the community and, bring charges that they think fit with what the community sentiment is about the crime. And, those oftentimes are unsuccessful. And so I think, unfortunately, district attorneys have a difficult role to play in this situation because they're held to the standard, or they have to meet the standard that's currently in the law. And so that's why I think this ultimately comes back to our last category, which is elected officials. I think they can alter the law in a way, maybe not in the kind of, categorical bright line use of force situation that Keith was talking about, But they can make it easier for prosecutors to bring these types of charges in the future and to make, kind of explicit situations and explicitly define deadly force for example, chokeholds. We're seeing that, be legislation both at the federal and state level, and defining that as deadly use of force could create a situation where, that might be more amenable to a prosecution where it would be appropriate. Rachel, you might have to clean that up. I'm going to pass it to you.
Well, the first thing I think of, when Lauren was speaking was everything she said was absolutely correct. But overall too, so let's go to the police chief. In the police union, I think just what I reiterated previously is just a dramatic shift in culture in regards to like how the police view themselves in the community and, how they view themselves with each other. So, there's this fear, that I think a lot of communities have, especially those people of color, trans and just other marginalized communities of there's like an us against them. Like if I was to call a police officer, for incident, can I be sure that they will protect me if I feel like unsafe or something happened and they just won't arrest me too, even though I was the victim. So I think that's really fundamental is like there has to be this really a big shift in culture of police. They are public servants. And while they're probably all police officers and police chiefs who do think that, it has to be really ingrained, whether it's with training, whether it's with mentorship, whether it's when there's a new, cadet on the streets and they are doing those community walks that used to be a thing. So policies are important and great, but if people don't believe in those policies and those laws, they can still move around them and break them and not fear consequences. So we really have to rethink what does policing mean in the sphere of public safety. Police, and I think, Keith will say this too, like police shouldn't be the end all of like every encounter when it comes to like mental health or just other altercations that are not in regards to like just general crime. So rethinking what does public safety mean in what context? And, officers have said before, we're not trained in mental health. We shouldn't be the first responders for these kind of calls. So what does that mean? What does it look like to have an unarmed mental health expert or provider come to these type of calls or just, so those kind of things. And when it comes to training, going back to police chiefs and unions, in part with culture too, like realizing unconscious bias too for accountability. I don't think it's a coincidence that people of color, again, are usually the ones who historically have had some of the worst encounters with police officers, and they still do. And let's be frank, I mean, if I have a child, I will have that conversation about what do you do if a police officer pulls you over? That's scary and that's frightening that I have to think that about for myself, for my family, my friends, and, just others who I care for. And the fact that we need these conversations show us a big problem. And perception too. I feel like police officers and the unions and DAs, like there has to be really better communication about what they're here to serve and protect. And if we can't have those frank conversations about how you feel when a police officer is on your block, policy is important, but it's not the end all of how to fix, these problems we're discussing today.
Rachel, if I was in the same room with you, I would reach across and give you a high five right now. Because of a few things that you said. One is you can create policies, you can create laws, you can put all of these words on a paper, but until you have a culture that polices with empathy and sees themselves as a part of the community, not just when there's a problem, but a part of the community all the time, then you start solving all of these issues. That starts at the top. So when you say police chief, what is my level of responsibility and accountability in this notion of accountability? Yeah, the buck stops with me. I have to set the policies. I have to set the tone for the agency. However, really what my job is to make sure that the men and women that work for me create value within my community, and they see themselves as a selfless actor that's out there wearing this badge as a symbol of public trust to do whatever it takes to push the safety and security of the community forward. To do that, the only way to do that is to put communities and police officers in front of one another when there is not a problem. Another thing that I believe it was Rachel that said, my philosophy on policing was framed over my last 28 years in this job. It started in a smaller city in South Los Angeles called Hawthorne. That was more of a minority city. And what was it? It was exactly what Rachel said. It was us versus them. You guys versus us, and zero tolerance. We're just going to go out there and really what that becomes is a reactive force to an issue at hand. And it's a Band-Aid to a problem. When you put lots of Band-Aids on, and you're going to have issues. So when you change your policing philosophy to be, all right, it's not us versus them, it's true engagement. We're part of this community. How do we get the community to see me behind the uniform? And how do I really sit down and know what the community thinks of me and what they want of me? When we really do that, we start solving problems all over the place. When I first got to Redondo, hey, God, I would really like to see more of our officers in schools and school districts looking at me like, yeah, that might be a bad message. We don't want the parents to think there's a problem. My response was, okay, leave it to me to change the culture to make sure that people, when they see us, they don't perceive us as being a problem. They perceive us as being part of a solution in a community. So, that's exactly, like, I couldn't agree more. That's exactly what I feel that my job is. I can go down through the rest of those. Part of maybe the solution to this, when you talk about police accountability and all the different layers and actors, when we check ourselves in law enforcement, when we write that policy about turning on a body-worn camera and holding people accountable to it, when we bring in third parties to do officer-involved shooting investigations and we completely remove ourselves from it, we start increasing a culture of accountability within the agency. And that to me is really, really important. Do people get fired, and commissions and boards and arbitrators give them their jobs back and they end up wearing that same badge that they were entrusted? Yes, they do. Lots of looks right now going into the decertification of police officers, through different commissions and things. And in general, we support that. Chiefs support that. We just don't support not having a seat at that table so that we can offer our perspective, much like you guys offered with me today. And, I'm agreeing with most of what you're saying. I do want to say one thing. We're good at being under the microscope. We're good at, we're getting beat up on a lot. A lot of times we earn it. A lot of times we don't, though. One thing I like to say is be careful with the broad brush. Just because agency X over here doesn't hold their people accountable and you're seeing them do crazy stuff on the news, be careful about changing my policy and my culture, or saying that my community doesn't trust me because maybe those cultures are so different and you could be wrong. So the broad brush approach, I fight back on that every chance I get. Yeah. But when an action is taken or a law is changed, you have to consider, how do we respond to it? And we need time. Chokeholds is one of them. My agency was an agency that allowed, it wasn't a chokehold, we called it a carotid restraint. And then in one day, one fell swoop, sorry, no more carotid restraints. We took it out of the policy. We need time to train our officers. What do they do now when for 20 something years, that was their go-to, a carotid restraint? What do they do now? And when we change things and we change training, it costs us time and money. And what happens in California, I'll tell you right now that lots of the changes end up becoming unfunded liabilities on us, and it makes it tough for us to be able to recondition officers. But those are kind of my thoughts on those things. Yeah, the DAs and the electeds, that is that everybody has their part. I agree with Lauren that the DAs have a very high standard to meet because that's criminal law. The electeds, when you make the laws, at least involve both perspectives, and I'm good with it.
Can I respond?
Absolutely.
So Keith, I hear the whole don't paint officers with a broad stroke or brush, and I hear that, but I think something, as a person, just as a general citizen, I think something, and as a Black woman too, I think what gets a bit frustrated on our end is, people of color have been, a lot of times I've been painted with a broad brush for police officers, so I think that's why there's just like this urgency too of like, we understand that it's not all officers, it's a systemic thing, but I would say like a lot of officers do their best when it comes to policing. But I mean, I want to be clear that there's a reason too, like there's various neighborhoods and communities that are patrolled more, than others. And I'll just be quite frank. No matter what happens, no matter my education, no matter my income, no matter where I live, my likelihood of being pulled over or having a bad interaction with police is just higher than other people. My father, I can tell you the number of stories that my father and just other members of my family have been pulled over just because. And why can't we get that same sentiment? Like, don't paint us with a broad brush from law enforcement. So like the whole treat people how you want to be treated, So we've been taught and treated that if I'm a certain type of person, I may be interacting with law enforcement more often just because of who I am. And I think it's not working. It's not working. And my other point too is I think you're an exception when it comes to these conversations. I'm really glad we're having this because I'm just so curious about how, even with the work Lauren and I do, I was always curious about just the mindsets of police officers. And I always get a sense when people are asking for change because things aren't working. I understand you need time to retrain people with various tactics, but if something happens to me tomorrow because someone wasn't trained properly, that doesn't matter for me and my family. I'm still harmed from that action. So I appreciate you coming here, but I get a sense that there's a defensiveness when the community and others, like, we want change because this is not benefiting anybody. Like, the police officers aren't benefiting from this. We're not benefiting from this. And it just seems that through the work we do and just, from my other experiences, there's always some sense of pushback. Like, just hold on, wait, just like slow it down. But like, there's how much time can we spend waiting, if we all catch up? And I want to put that out there because I do just, this the space to have these conversations. And I just want you to hear these concerns because, professionally we deal with it, but also personally, it's something we live with too.
I love to hear what you're saying. And I still agree with 90% of what you say. It's been 30 years since the Rodney King incident. My early days in policing were framed by that. I'll just tell you, I think, let me fast forward. Sorry, Clayton, we're totally off of police accountability, but if we want to talk about police accountability, let me offer you what I think my solution is. And we've touched on a lot of these things. It's true community engagement as a policing philosophy, but true, not on the surface, not, hey, we're a community policing agency and I've got a team of community police officers who do certain things on the days that they work. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a 100% philosophy of engagement so that when Rachel says there are certain neighborhoods that are patrolled more than others, those neighborhoods are really, really happy about that. A level of policing and engagement that really shows that the officers are one with the community and that the community are one with officers. So sounds all great, right? But how do you do it? Every community is different. Rachel's, yours is different than mine. Mine is different than Lauren's. And we all know it's different than where did you say Eastern Oregon, Clayton? So all these communities are different. And so they all need something different. How does the police department really know what they want? You've got to ask. You can ask now through technologies. We're using incredible technologies to engage with the public to see what it is their true concerns are, but you've got to sit down with them. One of the things we do here is we create this community engagement board that meets with us. There's about 35 members, and we have these hard conversations. When something goes down in Minneapolis and it's on the news, we're with our community engagement board and we're having these hard conversations. And we're allowing them into our agency, but we're receptive to what they say. They actually help us frame policy. They actually help us hire and promote people. That way, our community will believe that we are truly working with them. And I think that is how you truly get to accountability. Because now when the officer wears the uniform and the culture of the agency is set up that way, your list, Clayton, was police chiefs, unions, DAs, electeds. What's their role in accountability? What about the officer that is wearing the badge? Like that's the person that we need to drive accountability into from day one. So when you set up this culture of true community policing philosophy, they're going to be accountable to themselves and their community because they're going to feel like they own it. And I really think that's the answer. But the reality is many police agencies see themselves more as a reactive force than this kind of proactive partner.
And if I can respond, I mean, I think all of that is really fantastic and great. And just something that really stuck out that Rachel said about kind of our differing perspectives, not only because you're law enforcement, but you're also local, right? Like you have this very specific experience with your community. And we're kind of taking this in from a national perspective. So, I think the reason that we have this tendency to kind of see that these kind of community policing philosophies aren't real effective or, aren't real genuine in some experiences is because we are looking at it from this broader perspective and also looking at it from a historical perspective, right? Like, why did police forces begin in the United States? They were slave catching forces, right? I just think it's important to remember kind of the context for why the national perspective is what it is. And I think, you can do so much at the local level to detach what your police force is doing or what a police department is doing in a specific community. But I think some of the broad strokes and kind of generalizations are because like policing is a system, it's an institution, and it's hard just kind of to detach things from their origin. And I would also just note that I think, what you're doing with your community board is fantastic, but, some of that does seem like something that's very, you driven. You're a great police chief, and it seems like this is something you value, and this is how you think policing is most effective. If someone who's not as great as you comes in afterwards, we're kind of, we lose that, right? So I think that that's why it's important to always, I think from our perspective anyways, to kind of see these things as systems, and we have, these best practices that we can derive from Redondo Beach, but it's just kind of difficult to detach that from the broader context a lot of time.
Agreed. I think maybe, part of moving forward is taking best practices. So maybe the best practice does come from Redondo Beach, or it comes from some other agency, but let's take those and model them at the federal level and pass them out to everybody. Let's take policies that we can agree on at the federal level and hold everyone to the same standard. There's been some attempts at this, but generally the federal attempts to kind of make law enforcement consistent across the board are more like, hey, we'll continue to give you grant money if you have these types of policies. That's pretty weak. And I think that law enforcement would support more consistency. I mean, look, I want I want every police agency, no matter what, having the best practice, and I really want their communities to feel that they're wanted there, and I want those officers to use empathy and compassion when they enforce that. Now, what are the best practices to get to that? I'm not totally sure. I know what works for me, but yeah, let's institute those more on a national level. And I get what you're saying. Yeah, easy for me to sit back and say, well, I can kind of carve out or push back because we don't do that, and that's true. But hey, I'm with you. I want everyone to do it because I sat back and watched the Floyd video and went, great. I mean, all of this work, my life's work behind community engagement is now going to be in question, and I'm like, why? It sets us all back. So I really think that we got to figure out, Lauren, how to take these policies and put them across the board. We're getting there in some with some respects. One example, there's a company called Lexipol. I don't know if you've heard of them. You probably deal with it if you're reading police policies. You probably notice, well, that's the same one. I just read it over here. I read it over there. Well, that's kind of a good thing. Now, you may not agree with the policy, but if more and more agencies are having similar policies, that's at least a good start. We're not affecting what Rachel and I were talking about the culture, but at least we're evening the playing field for the rules, because best practices do end up in policies. Outside investigations, or the way that an internal affairs investigation is done to hold someone accountable. But I mean, that stuff's in there. So, hey, I mean, it's starting, but yeah, there's more work to be done.
Well, we have 5 or so minutes left, which is great, considering that I was hoping that I would have to speak not very often, and that you guys would just carry on talking about accountability. And yes, we may have kind of drifted a bit, but we all came back to the conversation did ultimately come back to what can we do to, if not increase accountability, reduce the need to hold someone accountable. And that I think the biggest and most insightful things that I pulled out of your conversation so far is, first of all, that stereotyping anybody is probably not the best solution, whether it be police or races or any other group, and that a deep level of understanding is pretty necessary, especially when it comes to an authority figure in a group. Like, that authority needs to be deeply understanding of the community that it has authority over. And then that kind of just reduces the overall need for accountability in general, because everybody understands everybody equally, and nothing kind of gets out of hand. So I want to ask, with the last couple minutes that we have, just a real quick, what's the most insightful thing that you gathered from the other side of the argument? So from Rachel and Lauren, the most insightful thing, whether it be a solution to accountability forwardly or a solution to accountability in a way that reduces the need. What did you get out of Chief of Police Keith, and Keith, what did you get out of Lauren and Rachel from the National Police Accountability Project? We'll go with Lauren and Rachel first, whoever wants to start.
I can start, Lauren, give you a quick break. I think what the most insightful thing I got from this conversation is that the fact that people like Keith exist, that there are, people in law enforcement, especially those in positions of leadership, that are really critically thinking about the status of policing now and how it can be better. Like I said before, I do think that there's from my experiences professionally and personally, there's just been some sort of resistance to the call of action, from police officers about things are not working clearly. People are getting harmed. There's a lack of trust with both sides, and it's not getting any better. And I feel like when we come to the table to have these discussions, there's just this automatic defensiveness to like, well, our jobs are hard. We're not saying your jobs are hard, but things could be better. And then you get better quicker. So the thing that I really received from Keith is that there are those who, while they're doing their daily jobs of policing, they are thinking strategically and systematically about what can be done better to benefit everybody who, whether it's in policing, who experience policing as a citizen. So I appreciate this conversation, and I wish we had more time to ask. I want to ask more questions, but I know time is wrapping up.
Yeah, since we're short on time, I'll strongly second everything Rachel said. Keith, it was really great to hear from you. And I think, one really great point that you made is kind of, when we're talking about accountability, it's not just kind of high level, decision makers who need to heed the call to accountability. It's everybody. And I think that can be extrapolated and applied to, these general conversations about, we all have a role to play in figuring this out. It's not just kind of on the police chief. It's not just on, the union rep. It's not just on elected officials. Like we all can, do our part to advance accountability, whether we're on the force or not. So I think that was a really great point.
And I mean, what I took from you guys is that we're all talking the same language. Like we all kind of want the same thing. It's these walls in society get built because people won't sit down and have the honest conversation. They won't listen. They take their own point of view, and that's the answer. And that's not the answer. The answer is sitting down, building relationships like this. When we used to do coffee with a cop, we called it one cup at a time, but it's the solution, right? It's let's talk to one another and hear each other out. And what I took most from this is that we all want the same thing. We have many of the same ideas. We just got to figure out how to put them all together. And I'm getting towards the end of my career, and I'm excited that there's people much younger than me that are like, no, we're going to take this on. Because when I take the badge off, I'm still going to be the citizen living in a city that wants the same thing that you do now and that I want from my officers. So it's just refreshing to know that people are approaching this issue appropriately, because the reality is many are not approaching this issue appropriately, and they're not having any gains from it. So kudos to all you. Happy to meet you. I actually want to talk more. So, let's have a text string or email string after that. And we should get back on the line because I'm committed. I'm committed to help you guys push forward.
I'd love that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let's do it.
Thank you, all three of you, Keith, Lauren, and Rachel, for joining today to talk about this. And for everyone watching, we hope that you all learned just as much as we did, because it was very insightful, I think, and there was a couple of very profound moments hidden in there. So thank you.